My name is Jessamine Webster, and I'm 38 years old. On paper, I'm a financial consultant specializing in nonprofit organizations, a job I've held for 14 years. People often say I'm dependable, meticulous, the steady hand behind complicated budgets and audits. I'm the one who quietly supports those around me, making sure the numbers add up, that every penny is accounted for, and that financial crises never spiral out of control. It's a role I've embraced not only professionally but also within my family. I've always tried to be the calm center, the problem solver when money matters get tangled. But despite my efforts, family dinners remain a battleground where acceptance feels just out of reach. I remember slipping into the leather booth that night, the dim light of the restaurant casting a muted glow over the polished wood table. The clatter of dishes and murmur of other diners created a familiar hum, but I felt isolated, as if an invisible wall separated me from the people seated just a few feet away. Meredith, my older sister, sat across from me, her smile polite but icy, eyes flicking with unreadable disdain. Samuel, my younger brother, lounged beside her, the golden child of the family, effortlessly charming and clearly in his element. The table was full of laughter and the kind of easy conversation that should have included me. Instead, I was a shadow, a guest barely tolerated, the adopted sister who didn't quite belong. It wasn't the first time Meredith had made me feel like an outsider. Tonight, though, the slights were more pointed, sharper than usual. Halfway through the meal, as I reached for the breadbasket, Meredith's voice sliced through the clink of glasses. "Jessamine," she said, her tone casual but laced with something colder. "Why don't you go find another table? This one's for family only." The words landed like a punch to the gut. "Not here. Family only. Not adopted," she added with cruel precision, as if explaining it to anyone who might not have heard the message clearly. The room seemed to hold its breath. I could feel every eye on me, the weight of their silence more deafening than any outburst. Robert and Elaine, my adoptive parents, exchanged looks but said nothing. Samuel gave a tight-lipped smile, as if this was all just part of some inside joke I was supposed to understand. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the shadows and escape the humiliation settling in my chest like a stone. I obeyed, moving away to the corner of the restaurant, a stranger among strangers. Then came the final blow. The server approached, discreet yet deliberate, and placed the check in front of me. $3,070 staring back like an accusation. No explanation, no splitting of the bill, just that staggering figure dropped squarely on my side of the table. A silent message that I was not just emotionally excluded, but financially burdened too. My husband, Mark, sat beside me, his eyes filled with quiet sympathy, but even his support couldn't shield me from the sting. Our 2 children squirmed beside him, sensing the tension but too young to grasp the full meaning. I lifted my glass, took a sip to steady my voice, and subtly slid the bill underneath my napkin. From a distance, I could hear the hostess's voice rise above the restaurant's ambient noise. "Just a moment, please." The words hung in the air, a promise of confrontation or revelation yet to come. In that moment, amid the clatter and murmurs, I realized something fundamental had shifted. This family dinner was no longer just a gathering. It was a battlefield where my place was questioned, my worth denied, and my patience stretched thin. But beneath the hurt was a flicker of resolve, a quiet determination that whatever came next, I wouldn't let this break me, because sometimes the deepest wounds demand the most deliberate healing. Growing up, the Webster household was a stage set for favoritism as clear as day, though it was draped in the polite tones and tight smiles we all learned to wear. Meredith was the undisputed star in the family's eyes, the one who shone effortlessly with their approval and praise. From early on, it was clear that she had the golden ticket, a combination of looks, charm, and that uncanny ability to command attention. Robert and Elaine seemed to orbit around her, celebrating her every success with a kind of enthusiastic fervor that left little room for anyone else's achievements to matter. I remember the sting of those early moments most vividly, not because of anything dramatic, but because of how normal they felt at the time. Like the year I won a small regional award for a school project, something I was proud of and excited to share. I brought the certificate home, clutching it tightly, hoping for some acknowledgement beyond a passing glance. Instead, Elaine barely looked up from her conversation and said, "That's nice, dear, but Meredith just got accepted into that prestigious summer program everyone's talking about. Isn't that more impressive?" Robert nodded along, his smile fixed but distant, as if my news was a polite ripple on the surface of a much bigger wave. Birthday parties were another battlefield cloaked in smiles. Meredith's parties were lavish affairs, the kind filled with friends, music, and perfectly coordinated decorations. I would watch from the sidelines, clutching a smaller gift bag that seemed to shrink in significance beside the extravagant presents Meredith received. Even photos told the story. Meredith at the center, radiant and surrounded by people, while I was pushed to the edges, sometimes cropped out of the frame entirely. One year, I wasn't even included in the official family photo because it wouldn't look right. The words echoed long after the flashbulb popped. It wasn't just the adults. Samuel, though younger, was swept up in the same tide. He absorbed the unspoken rules quickly. Meredith's word was law, and I was the outsider to be tolerated. When I tried to join their games or conversations, I was met with subtle rebuffs or dismissive glances that made it clear I was an afterthought at best. At family gatherings, I often felt like a ghost drifting through rooms filled with whispers and sidelong stares. The phrase, "You're not really one of us," wasn't always said aloud, but it was felt in the silence that followed every attempt I made to belong. In school, I worked hard to prove myself, excelling in academics and extracurriculars. Yet, whenever I shared my achievements, the response was polite, but lukewarm. It was as if my success was less a reflection of hard work and more a calculated duty to avoid embarrassment. I learned to celebrate quietly, swallowing my pride so the family's focus could remain where it belonged, on Meredith and Samuel. Over time, these small but persistent rejections began to shape my understanding of what family meant. I told myself that these were just family quirks, that the coldness wasn't personal, but part of some odd dynamic that would smooth out with time. I hoped that as I grew older, the veneer of politeness would crack to reveal genuine affection underneath. But instead, the favoritism only deepened, solidifying like ice around my heart. The dismissals, the exclusions, they became a constant soundtrack, a reminder that my place in this family was conditional, fragile, and always secondary. Robert and Elaine, in their own ways, reinforced this hierarchy. To them, Meredith was the perfect reflection of their hopes and social standing, flawless, accomplished, and worthy of their attention. I was the quiet anomaly, the adopted daughter who didn't quite fit the picture they wanted to present to the world. Their pride was outward, but the messages toward me were clear. You are cared for, yes, but always at arm's length. You are part of the family, but only as long as you don't upset the balance. Those childhood wounds, buried beneath years of forced smiles and silences, were not just about exclusion. They were about identity, about grappling with the ache of wanting to be fully known and embraced, and the painful realization that, in this family, being truly seen was a privilege reserved for some, not all. And yet, in the quiet corners of my heart, I held on to hope. Hope that time, or maybe my own steadfastness, would one day rewrite the rules of this family's story. But the truth was settling in, slow and heavy. The patterns were not accidents, and the coldness was a choice. Over the years, I made choices that, in hindsight, were less about personal ambition and more about holding together the fragile threads of a family that seemed to unravel whenever I wasn't the one keeping everything aligned. I turned down major career opportunities, not because I lacked the drive, but because Robert and Elaine's aging needs required constant attention. Their health was declining in ways that weren't always visible, and I became the steady presence, the one who scheduled doctor's appointments, managed medications, and ensured the house ran smoothly. My days were a tightrope walk between meetings with nonprofit clients and the quiet vigilance demanded by caregiving. I remember one particularly tough autumn when Robert's heart condition worsened. I had just been offered a promotion that would have relocated me to a bigger city, a chance to lead a major project that could have catapulted my career to the next level. But the thought of leaving them alone, of abandoning Elaine during her episodes of anxiety, of watching my father struggle without someone who knew every detail of his complicated medical regimen. It was unbearable. So, I declined. Again. Financially, I gave more than most knew. Managing the household finances was a role I took on unofficially, but it was one I executed with precision. There were no spreadsheets that Elaine or Robert maintained on their own. I was the one reconciling bills, negotiating with contractors, and tracking every dollar spent on groceries, utilities, and unexpected repairs. I did this pro bono, not expecting praise or thanks. It was simply part of the invisible labor I performed to keep our family's home from spiraling into chaos. Then there was Samuel's startup business. When he first approached me for a loan, I hesitated, naturally worried about mixing family and finances. But Samuel was charismatic and full of promise, and I wanted to believe in him. So I lent him tens of thousands of dollars. Not a small sum by any means, but money I could spare because I'd saved steadily over years of careful budgeting. I watched him pitch to investors, celebrated small victories, and stayed optimistic even when the business faced setbacks. I never asked for formal repayments, never demanded the recognition I deserved. Instead, I buried those sacrifices deep, tucked away in notebooks filled with dates, amounts, and quiet hopes. My husband, Mark, bore witness to all of this. He saw how I juggled the roles of career woman, caregiver, and family accountant, often at the expense of my own well-being. Our children grew up aware, though too young to articulate it, of the tension under the surface during family events. Mark was my anchor, the one who reminded me that my worth wasn't dictated by Meredith's cold glances or Samuel's dismissive words. Yet even his support couldn't erase the emotional toll, the exhaustion, the loneliness, the creeping sense that my efforts were invisible to the very people they helped the most. I recall evenings spent after the kids were asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with a ledger open before me, reconciling accounts for the Webster household while a familiar ache settled in my chest. The silence of the house contrasted sharply with the storm of emotions inside. I wondered if my devotion was ever noticed beyond the mechanical execution of responsibilities. Did anyone see the nights I stayed up late agonizing over unpaid bills? The afternoons I canceled lunches with friends to drive Elaine to therapy? Or the way I silently swallowed the sting of Meredith's dismissals so the family's fragile peace wouldn't shatter? Despite all this, part of me clung to hope. I told myself that loyalty and sacrifice would eventually soften the edges of rejection, that my steady presence would break through the invisible barriers separating me from true belonging. I believed that if I kept doing the hard work, showed unwavering commitment, the family might finally see me, not as the adopted one or the background figure, but as a daughter, sister, and a vital part of their lives. But the reality was harsher. The more I gave, the more the family seemed to take for granted. My contributions became expected, almost invisible, as if generosity was a currency only I paid. No one acknowledged the toll it took, or the sacrifices made in silence. Instead, subtle indifference and blatant exclusions continued, wearing down the hope I tried desperately to hold on to. In the quiet moments, I documented everything, not out of bitterness, but as a way to remind myself of my own worth. My notebooks, filled with dates, expenses, and emotional notes, became a testament to a life spent giving without recognition. They were also a shield, a record for when the time came to confront the reality I had long denied, that my family's love and acceptance were conditional, and that my loyalty, no matter how deep, might never be enough to break through the walls erected against me. Yet, even as the weight of these realizations pressed down, I continued to show up, to care, to manage, to lend, because, for better or worse, this was my family. And despite everything, I still wanted to believe in the possibility of change. I still remember that evening at the charity gala with unsettling clarity, as if the sharp edges of what happened were etched permanently into my memory. The ballroom was gleaming under crystal chandeliers, the air thick with the hum of polite conversation and the clinking of glasses. Everyone was dressed to the nines, and the room buzzed with the kind of energy that comes from money mingling with good intentions. I arrived with a quiet sense of purpose, my role behind the scenes as the family's financial steward, tucked carefully beneath my professional calm. I was there as always, managing the numbers, the logistics, the countless details that kept the Webster Family Foundation afloat. Meredith was already near the stage when I arrived, radiant in a sleek emerald gown that caught the light with every movement. She smiled easily, the kind of practiced charm that made people gravitate toward her. Samuel stood beside her, equally polished and confident. I felt like an invisible thread in the tapestry of their polished public image, a presence unseen, yet expected to support the fabric. As the evening unfolded, speeches were given, donors thanked, and the foundation's accomplishments highlighted. Then Meredith took the mic. Her voice was strong, commanding. She spoke of the Family Foundation's recent successes with a flair that drew applause, her words carefully crafted to impress the crowd. But as she detailed the funding sources, I noticed the subtle erasure of my name. With a graceful but deliberate omission, she credited Samuel publicly as the primary benefactor and financial architect, claims that were not only inaccurate, but deeply hurtful. Inside, I felt my chest tighten. Years of quietly managing the foundation's complicated budget, painstakingly preparing grant applications, and steering the organization through financial storms, all erased in a single, polished moment. I kept my expression neutral, nodding along politely as applause washed over the room. The last thing I wanted was a scene, especially in a setting so public. But the sting lingered, a sharp reminder of how invisible my work often was, especially in the eyes of my own family. Later that night, as the gala wound down and guests mingled with cocktails in hand, I found myself on the fringe of conversations, watching Meredith bask in the glow of compliments and congratulations. Samuel was charming everyone with stories of his vision for the foundation's future, the kind of buzzwords and confident promises that drew nods of approval. I wanted to speak up, to clarify the truth, but the moment was not mine to take. The polished veneer of family success was tightly controlled, and I was the quiet accountant in the background, not the star. The very next weekend, the family gathered again, this time to celebrate my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. The venue was a sprawling estate, the kind of place designed for grand festivities and formal photos. As guests arrived, laughter and warm greetings filled the air. I wore a dress carefully chosen to strike a balance between understated and elegant, hoping to blend in without drawing attention. But as the evening drew on, my place at the event became painfully clear. For the main dinner, the seating arrangement was like a silent hierarchy etched in wood and fabric. Meredith and Samuel sat proudly at the head table, flanked by Robert and Elaine. I was placed at a side table, distant from the center of celebration and conversation. The space between us felt wider than the mere physical distance, a chasm carved by years of unspoken judgment. During the meal, Samuel's casual dismissal was like salt in a wound. When someone mentioned the family foundation, he casually remarked, "Oh, Jessamine? She's just the fundraiser." The words were delivered with a lightness that masked their cruelty, but I felt them keenly. It was as if my years of effort were reduced to a trivial role, as if my contributions were insignificant beside his assumed prominence. I forced a smile, my fingers tightening around my fork. The laughter at the main table seemed to drown out the quiet ache in my chest. I caught a few glances from other relatives, some sympathetic, others uncomfortable, but no one spoke up, and no one challenged the narrative Samuel spun so effortlessly. The evening dragged on with a mixture of formal speeches, toasts, and polite chatter. I tried to focus on the moments I could control, the tender smile from my mother when she passed by, the warmth of my husband Mark's hand in mine, the quiet presence of my children at my side. But beneath it all was a growing sense of invisibility, a painful reminder that in this family, my efforts and my identity were often overlooked or dismissed. That night, as I lay awake in the guest room of the estate, the weight of these slights settled heavily on me. The gala, the anniversary dinner, they were more than isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a pattern I could no longer ignore, the systematic erasure of my role, the persistent favoritism toward Meredith and Samuel, and the subtle but relentless message that I was less than family. And yet, amidst the hurt, A quiet determination took root. If my work and my worth were going to be invisible in their eyes, I would need to find ways to assert what was mine, what I built, managed, and sustained. The road ahead was uncertain, but that night marked a turning point, a moment when the quiet sacrifices I had made began to demand acknowledgement, not just from them, but from myself. That night at the family dinner, the air was thick with an uneasy tension I had grown all too familiar with, but nothing could have prepared me for the moment Meredith crossed a line that shattered whatever fragile hope I'd clung to. We sat at the long, polished mahogany table in the upscale restaurant, its soft lighting casting warm pools of glow over the neatly folded napkins and gleaming cutlery. The chatter around us was lively, but I felt increasingly disconnected, as if I were a ghost haunting a room full of strangers who knew me only by name, not by heart. Meredith's smile had been sharp, poised like a blade behind her delicate features. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the ambient hum, colder than I'd heard it in years. "Jessamine," she said, clearly loud enough for everyone at our table to hear, "why don't you go find another table?" Her eyes locked onto mine with an icy certainty that sent a chill down my spine. "This one's for family only, not adopted." The words landed like stones dropped into a still pond, rippling outward and fracturing the fragile normalcy I had been desperately trying to maintain. Every head turned toward me, their expressions a mixture of silent assent and discomfort. My heart hammered against my ribs as the room seemed to contract and push me away all at once. The fact that Meredith felt so comfortable to publicly declare my exclusion, and that no one around the table intervened, deepened the wound beyond words. Robert and Elaine, my adoptive parents, exchanged a brief glance that said everything and nothing, a mixture of avoidance and unspoken agreement. Their silence was deafening, a tacit endorsement of Meredith's cruelty. Samuel's lips curled into a tight, knowing smile, the kind that mocked without a single word. He looked to be enjoying the spectacle, the golden child basking in the family's approval at my expense. I wanted to disappear. The room's noise, clinking glasses, soft laughter, the murmur of other diners, became a distant blur as a cold numbness spread through my body. I pushed back from the table, my fingers trembling as I gathered my napkin and purse, trying to steady my breath. I obeyed Meredith's command without protest, moving away to an empty corner of the restaurant where the shadows seemed to promise invisibility. As I sat there, isolated and hollow, the sting of rejection settled deep into my bones. The meal I had anticipated, the rare chance to connect, to feel like I belonged, had become a public spectacle of my exclusion. Even Mark, seated beside me, could only offer a pained look, his eyes reflecting the helplessness I felt, but unable to shield me from the humiliation. Then came the final, cruel blow. The server approached with a plate of desserts for the other tables, but when he reached my sequestered corner, his hands didn't carry anything sweet. Instead, he set down the dinner check, front and center, right before me. I looked down, startled. The number glared back at me, 3,070. A sum far beyond any ordinary meal, dropped abruptly and unaccompanied by explanation. It was a message louder than Meredith's words. Not only was I unwanted at the family table, but I was expected to carry a financial burden that felt like punishment. The bill sat heavily in my lap, cold and accusing, as if the restaurant, the family, and the whole world were reminding me that I was an outsider here in every possible way. Mark reached over, his fingers brushing mine with a quiet reassurance. Our children squirmed beside him, sensing the tension but too young to understand the depth of what had just transpired. I lifted my glass of water, took a slow sip to steady my racing heart, and then carefully slid the check beneath my napkin, hiding the humiliating number from view, but not from my memory. From the far end of the restaurant, I heard the hostess's voice rise above the ambient noise. "Just a moment, please." The words hung in the air, a subtle summons that suggested this was far from over, that someone was coming, that confrontation or intervention might be imminent. In that suspended heartbeat, surrounded by strangers yet utterly alone, I felt the weight of everything, the years of unnoticed sacrifices, the quiet endurance, the relentless exclusion. The family I had hoped to belong to had drawn a clear line. I was not one of them, And yet, beneath the shock and sorrow, a flicker of something stronger stirred, an ember of resolve that whispered I would not let this break me, because sometimes the deepest wounds demand the most deliberate healing, and in that moment, I knew this fracture was only the beginning of a reckoning yet to come. That night, once the restaurant's murmurs faded behind closed doors and the city's hum softened to a distant backdrop, I sat alone in the quiet of my study. The soft glow of a desk lamp illuminated the scattered pages of my notebooks, pages filled with meticulous records of dates, dollar amounts, text exchanges, and the countless small moments that, taken together, painted a picture of years spent carrying more than my share of the weight. I ran my fingers over the worn edges of the paper, tracing the ink that documented not just finances, but the emotional ledger too, the silent sacrifices, the invisible labor, and the stings of exclusion that I'd swallowed down time and time again. I felt the lingering ache from the evening's humiliation, the sharp edges of Meredith's words echoing louder now in the stillness. Not adopted. The phrase wasn't just a rejection. It was a verdict, a judgment that severed me from the very notion of family, the public nature of it. The casual cruelty, masked as normal conversation, replayed relentlessly in my mind. I could still feel the eyes of the room upon me, the bated breath held by everyone around the table, as if they were waiting to see how I would crumble. But I hadn't crumbled. Not yet. As the initial shock settled, a clarity began to pierce through the fog of disbelief and pain. For years, I had told myself that family sometimes behaved imperfectly, that the coldness, the favoritism, the dismissals were just quirks, temporary shadows that time or my patience would eventually illuminate. I had clung to the hope that beneath the hard edges of their behavior lay some flicker of genuine love and acceptance, waiting to be uncovered if only I could prove my worth enough times. But now, with the quiet margin of distance, I could see the truth that had been lurking all along. These wounds were not accidents, not moments of thoughtless cruelty, but patterns woven deliberately into the fabric of our family. I thought back to the countless times I had bent myself into invisible shapes, turning down career opportunities, staying silent when my work was erased, lending money without expectations, caring for Robert and Elaine long past the point where they appreciated it. And for what? To be told I wasn't really family, to be blamed for a meal's cost that was absurdly inflated and dropped at my feet like a shackle, to watch the people who claimed to love me assign value only to what I could do for them, never to who I was. I felt a flicker of anger rise, hot and fierce, burning through the numbness. It wasn't the grief this time, not the aching sadness of rejection, but a sharp-edged fire of indignation. How had I allowed myself to be so invisible for so long? How had I let their dismissals define my worth? The anger pulsed beneath my skin, demanding recognition, demanding change. It was a force I hadn't allowed myself to feel fully before, buried as it had been beneath years of quiet endurance. The realization settled like a stone in my gut. They would never change. Meredith's cruelty was not a one-time lapse. It was a weapon she wielded, and the others stood around nodding, complicit. Robert and Elaine's silence was louder than any protest, a tacit acceptance that this was the family's unspoken rule. Samuel's smugness wasn't innocence, it was entitlement. And the rest, they followed suit, swept up in the tide of exclusion. I was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. The constant striving for acceptance, the endless giving without reciprocation, the silent hope that one day they would see me as more than the adopted one. All of it felt like a weight I could no longer carry alone. And then, beneath that exhaustion, a seed of something new took root. Resolve. Not the desperate hope of before, but a clear-eyed decision forged in the heat of betrayal. I owed them nothing. Not my patience, not my forgiveness, not my sacrifices. If they refused to treat me as family, then I would protect myself and those I loved. I would set boundaries, not with anger or shouting, but with quiet strength and unyielding clarity. The path forward wasn't clear yet. There would be difficult conversations, consequences that might fracture what little remained of the family's fragile facade. But I knew now that in order to reclaim my dignity, I would have to be deliberate. I had to stop giving blindly. I had to demand respect, even if it meant standing alone. I closed the notebooks and leaned back in my chair, the night around me thick with possibility. The pain was still there, raw and real, but beneath it, a fierce determination pulsed steady. This was no longer just about enduring. It was about surviving, about drawing a line in the sand. And as the clock ticked past midnight, I whispered to myself the truth I was finally ready to accept. This family had taken from me for too long. Now, it was time to take back control, on my own terms. That night, as the house finally quieted and the kids were tucked away in their beds, I sat at my desk staring at the scattered pages of my notebooks. The dim light cast long shadows across the room, but inside me, a new kind of clarity was burning bright. The humiliation from the dinner, Meredith's cold dismissal, the heavy restaurant bill shoved in front of me, had cracked open a part of me that had been quietly recoiling for years. The moment wasn't just a breaking point, it was a call to action. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood, moving to the window where the city lights flickered distantly. The night air was cool against my skin as I took a deep breath, trying to steady the swirling mix of anger and resolve. I had spent so many years giving, my time, my energy, my money, always hoping that my loyalty would translate into something real, something lasting. But hope had been a fragile thing, and it had finally shattered. If I was going to protect myself and my family, Mark and the kids, I needed a plan. No more blind generosity, no more silent suffering. Back at the desk, I began to lay out the hard facts, my family's dependencies, the tangled web of favors and obligations that had, until now, kept me anchored in their orbit. First, there was Samuel. His startup had been a constant drain on me financially. Tens of thousands lent, interest-free and unrecorded, because I believed in his potential and wanted to support my brother's dreams. But those dreams were propped up by my savings, by debts I had quietly accumulated. His calls for more funds had become more frequent, more desperate, and yet, he had never fully acknowledged what I had done, never treated it as a debt to be repaid. Instead, his entitlement grew. Then there was the caregiving, the invisible labor I carried for Robert and Elaine, managing medications, scheduling appointments, being the emergency contact, and the quiet presence that soothed Elaine's anxieties while Robert's health declined. I was the family's nurse, secretary, and financial manager rolled into one. It was exhausting, and yet no one else stepped in. If I withdrew that support, what would happen? It was a risk, but maybe the wake-up call they needed. And of course, the finances. Over the years, I had become the unofficial bookkeeper for the Webster household. Every bill paid on time, every repair tracked, every unexpected expense absorbed. More than that, I controlled the joint assets. Accounts set up years ago by Robert and Elaine, trusts and investment funds that I had helped to organize and now managed quietly behind the scenes. My name was on more documents than most realized, giving me leverage, though it was a double-edged sword. I spread out the notebooks, tracing the columns of numbers and dates, the ledger of quiet generosity. The records were my secret weapon, the proof of all that I had done, the debts owed, the favors granted. It was more than just money. It was the emotional currency of years spent holding the family together. But I wasn't naive. I knew that pulling back wouldn't be easy. The family was skilled in denial and manipulation. Meredith's charm masked a ruthless streak. Robert and Elaine's social standing depended on appearances. Samuel's ambition shielded him from accountability. This was a fortress built on fragile loyalties and brittle truths. I reached for my phone and opened a secure app to note down key points. Loans to Samuel, caregiving schedules, joint account details. I drafted messages to a trusted attorney I had consulted years ago, someone who understood the complexities of family and finance, who could help me untangle the knots without creating chaos. I needed legal advice on how to restructure control over shared assets, how to formally document the loans, and how to protect Mark and the children from any fallout. The last thing I wanted was for my family to suffer collateral damage while I fought this battle. As the night deepened, my mind shifted gears. I started mapping out the practical steps, changing passwords on shared accounts, withdrawing from caregiving visits gradually, setting clear boundaries in communication. I envisioned how I would calmly, firmly explain my decisions when the time came. No anger, no accusations, just facts and consequences. The notebooks became my blueprint, each page a testament to my endurance and a reminder that I was no longer willing to be invisible or taken for granted. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity and control. I paused, breathing in the silence of the house, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. The family I loved had shown me their true colors, and now it was my turn to act, with precision, with resolve, and with the quiet strength of someone who had finally decided to protect herself. Tomorrow would be the first step in a new chapter, a carefully planned, deliberate unfolding that no one would see coming until it was too late. The days that followed marked the beginning of a subtle but deliberate shift in my interactions with the Webster family. I approached this new phase with a quiet resolve, a strategic mindset sharpened by years of endurance and careful observation. It wasn't about making a scene or lashing out. Rather, it was about reclaiming control, slowly, methodically, and without unnecessary drama. The first step was the most difficult, declining Samuel's latest request for a loan. It was a text message, sent early one morning, the kind that had become a recurring pattern over the years. His tone was urgent but familiar, laced with the kind of charm that usually softened my resistance. "Jess, need to talk. Big opportunity. Could really use your help again." I stared at the screen for a long moment, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The impulse to respond with generosity was strong, but the weight of all those past favors pressed down firmly. I typed back carefully, keeping my tone neutral, but firm. "Samuel, I'm sorry. I won't be able to offer any more financial support at this time. I hope you understand." I hit send and felt a small but significant release, as if a door I had kept shut on my own needs was finally beginning to close. The weeks after that saw a continuation of this controlled withdrawal. I started pulling back from caregiving duties with Robert and Elaine. Where I once scheduled every appointment and stayed for late-night calls, I began to delegate more, involving professional caregivers and encouraging my parents to rely on others. It was difficult. My heart ached at the thought of stepping back, but I recognized that my own well-being had to take precedence. I wasn't abandoning them. I was setting boundaries that had long been overdue. Family communications also shifted. I was more selective about responding to messages and calls, especially those that carried implicit demands or veiled criticisms. When Meredith sent her usual snide remarks or passive-aggressive notes, I chose silence or brief, polite replies that signaled I was no longer engaging in the old patterns. Samuel's attempts to draw me into debates or guilt trips were met with calm refusals or a change of subject. The emotional tug-of-war that once drained me now bounced harmlessly off a reinforced barrier. Behind the scenes, I took practical steps to secure my position. I changed passwords on shared financial accounts, a move I had long contemplated but never enacted until now. It was a small but powerful assertion of control, a reminder that the safety and security of my own family couldn't be compromised by others' entitlement. I updated my will to reflect new realities, consulting quietly with my attorney to ensure that any assets or responsibilities tied to the Webster estate were clearly delineated and protected. These actions didn't go unnoticed. At the next family gathering, I sensed the subtle shift in atmosphere. Meredith's usual cold confidence flickered briefly as she noticed I wasn't as available or accommodating as before. Samuel's attempts to monopolize conversations met with polite but firm refusals. Yet, no one confronted me directly. It was as if the family was wary, uncertain how to respond to this new Jessamine, one who was no longer the silent giver, but a woman quietly drawing lines in the sand. Mark noticed the change too. He supported my decisions with steady encouragement, reminding me gently that self-care was not selfish. Our children sensed the lighter tension at home, even if they couldn't quite put it into words. For the first time in a long while, I felt a measure of peace in asserting my boundaries, even though the path ahead remained fraught with uncertainty. This phase of withdrawal was not a retreat, but a strategic repositioning. I was no longer just surviving the family's dynamics. I was preparing to reshape them. Each declined request, Each reduced visit, each firm but polite boundary laid a new foundation. The fortress of entitlement and exclusion that had long enclosed me was beginning to crack, unseen but undeniable. And as I stood firm in this quiet resistance, I knew the hardest moments were still to come. But this was my turning point. The moment I chose myself over the suffocating patterns of the past. The battle lines had been drawn, not with anger, but with the calm certainty of someone who had finally decided to reclaim her dignity. I remember the day of the next family gathering with a clarity that still surprises me. It was a late spring afternoon, the kind where the sunlight filtered softly through the old oak trees on the Webster estate's sprawling lawn. The air carried that faint scent of blooming lilacs mixed with freshly cut grass, an almost idyllic backdrop for what was about to unfold. The house was bustling as usual, polished and pristine, every detail arranged to project the perfect image of the Webster family's social standing. But beneath the glossy surface, I carried a quiet storm within me, a resolve tempered by years of silent endurance and careful planning. As I stepped into the grand foyer, I spotted Meredith across the room. Her smile was as dazzling and practiced as ever, but I could see a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes when they met mine. Samuel was nearby too, his easy charm a little more guarded this time. Unlike before, I didn't feel the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. Instead, there was a calmness, almost a cool detachment, that steadied my voice and sharpened my purpose. The gathering began with the usual polite exchanges, laughter that felt rehearsed, and the clinking of glasses filled with expensive wine. But when dinner was announced and we moved toward the dining room, I knew this night was different. The mahogany table stretched long and gleamed under the soft chandelier light, a symbol of the family's legacy, and, once again, a tribunal where my place had been questioned. Tonight, however, I wasn't just a passive participant anymore. When I took my seat, I met my parents' eyes briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between us, not one of guilt or blame, but of unspoken truth. Then I cleared my throat gently, drawing the room's attention without hesitation. The murmurs subsided, and all eyes turned toward me. Meredith's smile faltered, and Samuel's confident posture stiffened just enough to let me know they sensed the shift. "I want to speak clearly tonight," I began, my voice steady but carrying the weight of years. For too long, I have been the family's silent supporter, managing finances, caregiving, and providing financial assistance where it was needed. But that chapter is over. There was a ripple of surprise, a few raised eyebrows and exchanged glances. I continued, "Effective immediately, I am withdrawing all financial support for Samuel's business ventures. The loans I extended, significant sums, will no longer be available. I have also arranged for professional caregivers to take over the majority of the responsibilities I've held for Robert and Elaine. My time and resources must now focus on my own family and well-being." I watched closely as the room absorbed the announcement. Meredith's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second. Samuel's jaw clenched imperceptibly, but he said nothing. The air grew thick with a silence that spoke louder than any words. Then I took a breath and laid out the next revelation. I want to clarify something that has been overlooked for too long. The family foundation, the very one Meredith has publicly claimed as Samuel's achievement, was fully funded and managed by me. Every grant, every budget, every financial report was my responsibility. I have the documentation to prove it, and I am ready to share it if necessary. The room seemed to shrink inward, the polished veneer cracking just slightly under the pressure of truth. Robert shifted uneasily in his seat. Elaine's expression flickered between surprise and discomfort, and even Meredith's composure wavered for a moment. I continued, "Furthermore, I have legally severed all shared financial ties. Account passwords have been changed, and I have updated my will to reflect these changes. I am taking these steps not out of anger, but necessity. I will no longer be the family's invisible bank, nurse, or emotional punching bag." The weight of the words hung heavily between us. For the first time, I wasn't begging for recognition or pleading for inclusion. I was setting boundaries with clarity and finality. Mark stood quietly just behind me, a steady presence, and our children sat close, their innocent faces a reminder of why this moment mattered so much. I was doing this not just for myself, but for them, to model strength and self-respect in the face of neglect and cruelty. Meredith finally broke the silence, her voice low and sharp. "Jessamine, this isn't how families behave. You're making a mistake." I met her gaze evenly. "This is exactly how families behave when respect is absent." My words were calm but firm, leaving no room for debate. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere remained taut. Conversation was sparse, smiles forced, and the usual warmth replaced by a cold tension. I could feel every eye on me, some burning with anger, others with disbelief. But beneath it all, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from revenge, but from reclaiming my dignity and control. This gathering was no longer about fitting in or seeking approval. It was about drawing a line in the sand, and as I heard the distant sound of the front door closing behind departing guests, I knew the Webster family's story had irrevocably changed that night. The reckoning had begun, not with shouting or spectacle, but with the quiet strength of a woman who had finally chosen herself. The fallout was immediate and brutal, like a shockwave rippling through the carefully constructed Webster family facade. When I made it clear that I was withdrawing all financial support and caregiving assistance, everything that had been propped up for years began to crumble. The consequences weren't theoretical or distant. They hit hard, fast, and with a coldness that left no room for denial. Samuel's startup was the first to falter. For years, I had quietly funneled tens of thousands into his fledgling company, money he never formally acknowledged as a loan, money given out of a blend of hope and family loyalty. Suddenly, that stream dried up. His calls became frantic, laced with desperation disguised as entitlement. When the monthly payroll went unpaid, key employees started walking away, and investors began to question his ability to manage funds. The glowing promises Samuel once made at family gatherings gave way to strained explanations and excuses. I knew this unraveling was inevitable, yet hearing the panic in his voice as he tried to persuade me otherwise was a bitter reminder of how much I had carried alone. Meanwhile, Robert's health took a noticeable decline without my constant attention. I had been the invisible nurse, the one scheduling his cardiologist appointments, coordinating with home care aides, managing medication regimens, and stepping in during moments of crisis. For years, the burden was mine alone, silently borne to keep the family's image intact. When I began delegating those responsibilities to professionals and reducing my visits, the cracks showed. Robert's once steady routine faltered. Appointments were missed or delayed. Medications were taken inconsistently, and his mood darkened. Elaine, for all her social poise, struggled without my calming presence to manage the household chaos and her own rising anxieties. It was as if the entire delicate ecosystem I had sustained was collapsing. Elaine's social standing, which she guarded fiercely, began to erode under the weight of whispers fueled by the family's visible fractures. The once unshakable image of the Webster family was now marred by rumors, scuttlebutt about financial troubles, caregiving gaps, and a foundation teetering on the brink. Elaine responded with frantic calls and carefully crafted messages to her social circle, trying to contain the damage and protect the family's reputation. But the veneer was thin, and cracks spread faster than she could mend them. At home, Mark became my steadfast shield. As the family's demands turned into relentless pressure and guilt trips, he stood firmly by my side, absorbing the brunt of their manipulation attempts. Their calls were frequent, Meredith's sharp-edged accusations, Samuel's veiled threats, and even Elaine's emotional pleas. They tried to pull me back into the fold, to make me doubt the decisions I'd made, to remind me of family obligations, and what's best for everyone. But Mark's quiet support fortified my resolve. He reminded me gently that choosing myself and protecting our children was not betrayal. It was survival. The house felt different during those days, less burdened by tense silences, but heavier with the weight of the fallout. The children asked questions, sensing the shift, but not understanding the complexities. I answered as honestly as I could without fracturing their sense of security. I wanted them to know that standing up for what is right sometimes means making hard choices, even when the people you love don't agree. Behind the scenes, I kept meticulous records of every interaction and development. The notebooks that had once been my shield and refuge now served as a ledger of hard truths, proof of my sacrifices and the consequences of standing firm. I knew this was only the beginning. The family's fragile alliances were cracking, and the fallout would deepen. Yet, even as the tension mounted and the family's veneer fractured, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. No longer the silent giver or the overlooked daughter, I was reclaiming control. The path ahead was uncertain, and the damage irreversible. But for the first time in a long time, I was choosing peace over pain. The family's world was shifting beneath their feet, and I was no longer the footing they could count on. The financial ripple that began as a quiet withdrawal quickly morphed into a tidal wave, threatening to engulf everything the Webster family had long relied upon. I watched, with a mixture of sorrow and resolve, as the edifice they had built, partly on my unseen labor, started to buckle under its own weight. Samuel's startup, once buoyed by my steady financial support, began to bleed visibly. Without the loans I had quietly extended over the years, payroll became an impossible burden. Key employees, sensing instability, began to jump ship, and investors started demanding answers Samuel couldn't provide. I had always believed in his potential, had poured my savings into his dreams, but now the harsh reality of his dependence hit like a cold wave. His once charming calls shifted to frantic pleas, and when I politely declined, his desperation was palpable. It was painful to witness, but I knew enabling this pattern any longer would only perpetuate the cycle of entitlement that had long fueled our family's dysfunction. Meanwhile, my parents' health, the fragile foundation of the Webster household, began to show cracks without my steady presence. For years, I had been the invisible nurse and manager, orchestrating appointments and medication schedules with precision. Now, with professional caregivers stepping in under my guidance, the transition was anything but smooth. Robert missed his cardiology consults more often than not, his mood darkening with each skipped dose. Elaine's anxiety, usually quieted by routine and familiarity, flared unpredictably in my absence. The household, once a well-oiled machine under my watchful eye, now creaked under the strain. Elaine's attempts to hold it together were like a socialite clutching at straws, carefully arranging appearances, but unable to mask the growing chaos beneath. This disruption didn't stay hidden for long. Rumors began to swirl through the tightly knit social circles Elaine so fiercely guarded. Whispers of financial instability, neglect, and family discord spread like wildfire, eating away at the polished image the Websters had cultivated for decades. I could almost hear the muted gasps behind drawn curtains and the subtle shifts in conversation during charity luncheons and garden parties. Elaine's frantic calls to socialites and carefully crafted messages to quell gossip grew more frequent, more desperate. Yet the veneer cracked further with each attempt to patch the facade, revealing the fragility behind the glittering surface. The family's reaction to my firm stance was as expected as it was relentless. Meredith and Samuel flooded my phone with calls and messages, accusations thinly veiled as concern, guilt trips coated in sibling camaraderie, and even veiled threats wrapped in passive aggression. Elaine's pleas were tinged with manipulation, invoking family duty and legacy, trying to tether me back to the old order. But Mark was my bulwark against their onslaught. He intercepted many of these calls, his calm voice and steady presence a shield that allowed me to maintain my resolve. His belief in my right to set boundaries became my anchor in the storm, reminding me that choosing self-preservation was not betrayal. At home, the atmosphere shifted. The children, sensitive souls despite their youth, sensed the tension. The way my smiles were tighter, my answers more measured. They asked questions in quiet moments, their innocence seeking understanding in a world suddenly less predictable. I spoke to them truthfully, as much as their age would allow, explaining that sometimes standing up for what's right means making hard choices. I wanted them to know it was okay to protect themselves, that love doesn't mean enduring pain in silence. Throughout this upheaval, I maintained my records with meticulous care. The notebooks, once a private ledger of sacrifices and silent endurance, now chronicled the unfolding consequences of standing firm. Every missed payment notice, every delayed appointment, Every strained phone call was noted, not out of bitterness, but as a testament to the cost of toxic family dynamics. These were the truths I would carry forward, a reminder that respect and accountability must be mutual, not one-sided. The fractures within the Webster family grew wider. Some relatives, previously distant, began to murmur their own regrets, sympathetic yet powerless to intervene in the tangled web of loyalty and resentment. But Meredith doubled down, her blame heavy and unyielding, casting me as the disruptor rather than the one demanding fairness. The social circles Elaine once navigated with ease started to close doors, their once glowing invitations turning into cautious distance. With each passing day, I witnessed the slow unraveling of the narrative the Websters had carefully constructed, a perfect family united by blood and privilege. Instead, cracks appeared, revealing the fractured realities beneath: favoritism, exclusion, entitlement, and the cost of ignoring the quiet strength of the one who had held it all together. And while their world shook, I stood firm, not because I sought to punish, but because I knew that without boundaries, there could be no true healing. The story was far from over, but the ground was shifting beneath their feet. I remember the moment I finally sat down with Mark and my children one quiet Sunday afternoon, away from the tension and fractured expectations that had come to define so many of our family interactions. The air was warm, sunlight spilling through the windows and casting soft patterns on the floor. It was in that peaceful bubble that I shared with them. No defenses, no half-truths, what I had learned through all the pain, and what I was choosing moving forward. "I'm setting new boundaries," I told them, voice steady but gentle. "For any of my family who wants to be in our lives, respect isn't optional. It's the foundation. Equality, treating each other fairly without favoritism or exclusion, is non-negotiable. And accountability, everyone must own their actions and words. If these aren't honored, then distance is the only choice left." Mark reached over, squeezing my hand with quiet support. Our children, still too young to fully grasp the complexities of adult conflicts, looked to me with a mixture of curiosity and trust. I wanted them to understand that family wasn't just about blood or convenient roles. It was about choosing to nurture relationships built on mutual care and dignity. That decision to lay down clear terms wasn't easy. It came after years of bending, giving, hoping. But I had learned that love without respect is a hollow thing, and trying to force acceptance where none existed only deepened wounds. So, with the same meticulousness I applied to every budget and financial report, I began mapping out what healthy family meant to me and mine. No longer would I allow myself or my children to be collateral damage in a drama where I was expected to carry the weight alone. In the weeks and months that followed, I devoted myself to strengthening the family I had chosen: Mark, our children, and the close friends who had stood by us through thick and thin. We created new traditions, simple moments of connection that felt authentic and nourishing. Weekend hikes, quiet dinners where laughter wasn't forced, bedtime stories that wove together dreams rather than disappointments. These were the spaces where I found refuge and renewal. At the same time, I maintained the boundaries with my birth family. Phone calls became less frequent but more intentional. Invitations to events were accepted only when I felt the environment was respectful and safe. When old patterns of exclusion or manipulation tried to seep back in, I reminded myself firmly that my peace was priority. I kept my notebooks close, not as weapons, but as reminders of the lessons learned and the strength gained. Some family members reached out with tentative apologies, their voices laced with regret and the hope for reconciliation. I listened, weighing their words carefully. Forgiveness became a personal journey, one that didn't erase the past, but allowed me to move forward on my own terms. Others remained distant, entrenched in denial, or unwilling to confront the toxicity that had fractured us. I accepted that too, understanding that not every bridge could or should be rebuilt. What surprised me most was how liberating it felt to reclaim agency, knowing that I could decide who deserved my time, my energy, my love. The burden of being the perpetual peacemaker lifted, replaced by a quiet confidence that I was enough, exactly as I was. For so long I had measured my worth by their acceptance, but now I measured it by my own standards: integrity, kindness, and self-respect. This journey also transformed how I approached the future. I began to dream differently, not of being accepted by a family that never truly saw me, but of building a legacy for my children rooted in unconditional love and respect. I wanted them to grow up knowing their value wasn't dependent on others' approval, that they could set boundaries without guilt, and that family was ultimately the people who chose to show up with open hearts. Looking back, the Webster family dinners, the cold silences, the pointed exclusions, the crushing $370 bill were painful catalysts. They shattered illusions, but also freed me from a cycle that had cost me dearly. The cost was high, yes, but the price of staying silent would have been even higher. And so, I continue forward, carrying both the scars and the strength, choosing peace over pain, dignity over denial, and love that is freely given, not demanded. My story is still unfolding, but now I write it on my own terms,